Hello, everybody. Welcome in, welcome in. It's very, very nice to see some of the people that came in early. I hear there's probably some family in the audience watching. Regardless of who you are or where you are in the world, welcome today to our event with conversations with authors here at Book Passage. Today, we bring to you Monica West and her newest book, Revival Season. But before we get to our author, or speakers, I should say, properly, let me welcome you to Book Passage's Conversations with Authors series. If you're completely new here, well then Book Passage is an independently run bookstore out of the San Francisco Bay Area. We host and run book talks just like these very often throughout the week. Although we're kind of getting back to doing them live and in person, and we'll be ramping that up as the months continue to come along. We are streaming now live on YouTube, and we'll definitely continue to do so in the future. So, if you'd like to be alerted whenever any of these events start or go live, or whenever we post any pre-recorded author content, as we do from time to time, please consider subscribing to our YouTube channel by clicking the subscribe button just below the video. It's completely free to you. It helps us out absolutely tons. And if you click that little bell next to the subscribe button, you'll be alerted every time we go live, just like this. Regardless of what author it is, you can always pop in, check who it is, and then stay if you like it. If you'd like to check out our upcoming events and don't like the idea of subscribing to our overlord Google, you can go to bookpassage.com, where you can find our email newsletter, which goes out every Monday morning. And if you'd like to check out tonight's book, we highly recommend that you go to bookpassage.com by following the link at the very, very top of the description box, or the one that I have pinned in blue at the top. You can go to Book Passage and buy it there from us. Finally, if you have any questions for tonight's author, then please take the time to write it in the YouTube chat. It's just to the right of the video you're watching and just below, depending on what mode you're viewing it in. It is the only way to get your questions to the speakers, so don't miss your chance to ask them. We don't always get to every single one of them, but we do answer them in the order they come in. So if you're trying to get them in under the wire, very likely that your question will get skipped. Now let me introduce our author. Monica West was born and raised in Cleveland, Ohio, and received her BA from Duke University, her MA from New York University, and her MFA from Iowa Writers Workshop, where she was the Rona Jaffe Graduate Fellow. She was a Southern Methodist University Fellow in 2014, and she will be a Hedgebrook Writer in Residence in 2021. Revival Season is her very first novel. And also, in conversation tonight, we have the one, the only, Julie Carlucci, who is the lead of Book Passage's Signed First Editions Club. In addition to curating and researching unknown and debut authors throughout the year, Julie also designs personalized book lists for over 250, I'm sure that's probably increased by now, Book Passage clients across the United States, delighting avid readers every month with a perfectly picked book aimed to captivate, who wrote this? Enchant, entertain, and provoke thought. Julie leads multiple book group discussions in the Marin community, reviews nearly 100 newly published books a year, in addition to being an excellent and ever excitable colleague. Thank you for coming out tonight, everybody. Let me turn the show over to Julie and Monica.
Thank you, Nick. And welcome, Monica. It is an honor to have you here. Thank you for being part of our Book Passage conversation tonight. It's an honor to have you here. It's an honor to have named Revival Season as our July 1st edition pick. In addition to the very important themes and questions that your novel raises, I have to say the tension and dynamics you have crafted between the family members is captivating. I read it a while ago, before when we had to review the arcs to make the selection. And then I recently revisited it in audio format. And as I was mentioning before, even though I knew what was going to happen, I still was sweating. I was still tense, and I was entranced. And the grip on my emotions was, I couldn't believe it. I'm like, wait, you know what's gonna happen, but I was still sweating. And so it's just evidence of incredible writing. I mean, just to bring the reader so close to the action of what's going on that you really feel it at a physical level. Many have named Monica as the writer to watch for. Naomi Jackson from the Washington Post says West's debut marks the entry of a stalwart new voice in American fiction. I couldn't agree more. And Beth Mowbray from the Washington Independent Review of Books says, each year brings a new round of writers releasing their work into the world for the very first time, yet it remains relatively rare for one of them to produce a novel so profoundly well written that it fills a hole readers didn't even know existed in the canon. I couldn't agree more. Before we dive into our discussion, I thought it'd be helpful for our audience to get a sense of the main character, Miriam, and her voice. So I asked Monica to do a short reading for us, and then we can dive in. Monica?
Perfect.
Good?
Yeah, perfect. First of all, thank you, Julie, for that introduction. It is so great to be here with you. I met Julie back in July when I had signed a bunch of first edition copies. And so it's so good to be back in the room with you. And for people who are here watching, thanks for showing up and logging in. So Julie asked me to read a section that shows Miriam's voice. And so the section that I picked, I didn't want to do something too spoilery. So I'm avoiding spoilers for people who haven't read the book or who haven't finished. But I picked a section where Miriam's the main character and she's 15 when the book begins. And she and her mother have this little ritual at night where they kind of sneak a book that their father doesn't allow them to read, and they read it together. And so the father is an evangelical Baptist preacher in the South, in Texas in particular. Miriam's the oldest daughter of 3, soon to be 4 children in the Horton family. And so this scene I picked a little bit has a connection to a writer that I admire and that I think fingerprints are on my life and my consciousness. And so this section is when Miriam and her mom are kind of sneaking away and reading a book and spending some time together. And Miriam is starting to have some questions about her father's leadership and her parents' marriage and a lot of things that she's just trying to grapple with. So later that night, I heard 3 soft raps on my door. Before I could answer, Ma slipped into the crack that let the light in. She approached my bed with her arms behind her back, a sly smile spreading across her face as she presented the newest library book on outstretched palms. She hadn't come for our secret reading session since Bethel, and the fact that she was back meant that things had returned to a semblance of normalcy. I put my prayer journal on my nightstand and straightened in bed, holding her elbow as she climbed over me. She'd been slowing down more now than during her pregnancy with Isaiah, but I tossed the thought aside. Look what I have, she whispered, her eyes darting to where Hannah was sleeping a few feet away. It's the one that you requested a couple months ago. It just came in. I held the cellophane wrapper and fingered the embossed letters on the cover, Song of Solomon. It crinkled open and I pressed my nose against the new pages. Even though we were surrounded by books at home, Bibles and multiple translations and biblical commentaries, those books weren't mine. And though I love the stories of Miriam, Moses, Deborah, and Esther, the books that I got with Ma from the library were different. It felt good to try on lives that weren't mine, lives that didn't involve traveling every summer. I fell in love on those pages and felt the ache of heartbreak that I'd never experienced. When did you get it? A pang of jealousy rose in my throat, and my words came out more accusatory than I intended. The library was a place we went together when Papa was at the church for trustee meetings. Under the guise of getting more Christian books to replenish the homeschool baskets in our basement, we always chose one secular book that we hid in the middle of the larger stack to read at night. The title of this one made things easier, though. If Papa saw it, he would never suspect that it wasn't about the Bible. Let's read a couple of pages, she said. We have some time. She glanced at her watch as I slid closer to the nightstand to give her more room. In the puddle of light from the desk lamp, I read aloud, letting my tongue taste words that Papa could never know I was reading. I felt the slip of Mr. Smith's blue silk wings on my bare arms, imagining his leap to his death and the way his stomach must have plunged to his feet on the way down. Ma leaned her head into my shoulder and nodded with pride when I read words like bereft and transfixed. And in an instant, I was 5 again, only this time her finger wasn't dragging beneath letters on the page, bouncing each B or releasing a tiny spit stream with each P. And since she wouldn't read these books aloud herself, she got some joy at hearing me tell her about a life that she had once lived, a life I never had. My face grew warm as I read about Macon undressing his wife, Ruth, and my words halted. Did you fall in love before him? I asked the wall. I crossed my legs to quell the tingle in my crotch that rose when I thought about Jason Campbell, but the feeling dissipated soon thereafter when I remembered Papa's withering gaze. Ma paused for a moment, seeming to weigh whether to answer me. My first love was when I was 12. He was my next door neighbor, Curtis. His name was closer to a giggle than a word when it came out of her mouth. Anyone else? There were other crushes before your father, she laughed. Kevin and Christopher, but they weren't real. I knew it the second I met your father because they all vanished, their names and faces. And for an instant, nothing else had any meaning in my life. What was it like, falling in love? She stretched out her legs in my twin bed, her toned dancer's calves twining around each other like cords in a rope, her pointed toes emphasizing her high arches. It was clear what he saw in her, a beautiful dancer who clung to his every word as though it were gospel. And she saw someone who could save her from her life. She told me that her heart burst when Papa pulled her, soaking, from the murky lake water. But lately I'd wondered if she had been desperate for anything to take her away from the house where she grew up. The boy who came to town wearing a suit that was 2 sizes too big happened to be in the right place at the right time and assorted her sudden love for God into a love for him. For a moment, all the power that she let him wield in the house made sense. She had never known Papa without God and never known God without Papa. Keep going, it's getting really good, she said, nodding to the book. I turned back to the open book and continued reading, even though my brain wasn't keeping up with the words. Ma put her hand on my knee. I must have paused too long. I know this hasn't all been easy, Miriam, and I'm sorry. Ma was inches away from me, her scent of laundry detergent and floral soap faint in my nose, but I couldn't look at her as she spoke. Sorry for what, Ma? Oh, I don't know. Nothing, everything. She tossed her hands in the air. As they fell back to the comforter, her voice dropped. He's different. I can't think of another way to describe it. The man that I married never would have hit the man in Bethel. I willed my chin to look in her direction. She was looking straight ahead at the closed door, at Hannah in the bed across from us. And I brought all of you along on this ride. It hasn't been easy for any of us, but particularly you. If I had known then what I know now. She cut herself off before the inevitable end of the sentence. What would you have done differently? There was no reply, but I felt her shoulders rise and fall in a shrug. I was really young. I was in love. Are you still? I snatched the words from the bottom of my throat. I expected her to chastise me for asking such a thing, but in the long pause that passed between us, the Ma who was always so certain about God and Papa didn't seem certain at all. It's not as simple as that, honey. It's not a yes or a no. You'll see. She pulled her knees up to her chest and hugged them. We heard a door open downstairs, and Ma quickly kissed me on the forehead before wishing me good night. I slid the book under my mattress after she left. The air felt heavier when she was gone, like someone had left a window open during a passing storm. Now that I'd seen Papa for who he really was, it was hard for me to understand how I'd once been one of his staunchest defenders. Perhaps Ma just had more faith in him, or faith in general, than I did. Or perhaps it was that she'd known him for a whole lifetime before I'd even been born. So for her to suddenly see him through different eyes might have felt impossible.
Wow. That 15-year-old girl, that there's so much going on and so much discovery going on and so much awareness, building. But my opening question to you is about that 15-year-old girl. Like, why the 15-year-old girl?
Such a great question. So for a very long time of my life, I taught ninth grade. I taught children of this age. And so I've taught high school for years and years and years. And so there's something about this age in particular where the world kind of breaks open. It's this interesting age where you are forming your own ideas and opinions about yourself, about the world, about what you see in front of you. And at that very moment, you're forming some sense of your own identity and differentiating yourself from your parents. And for Miriam, this profound differentiation happens over the course of this 1 year, beginning with this summer. And so 15 seems like such the perfect age for her to think about what she's been told and what she believes and what she may not believe anymore and what she used to believe. And that age is just the perfect place to interrogate this tension between who I am, who I've always thought I was and who I could be, and how that's different from what I've been taught and who my parents are, and seeing my parents as people who are also flawed. So the whole book is about awakenings in lots of ways. And 15 seems like an age ripe for awakenings. And I've seen that myself in classrooms over the years. So that age just seemed right to me for that reason.
Right. It's so, and I really appreciate the way you write it and the way you, you pace and present the information to the reader, because I really get a sense, like even hearing you read it again, you really go back to that 15-year-old. You remember that I think everybody remembers that 15-year-old self of when you believe you had this belief system.
Yep.
And then all of a sudden something entered it that you're like, wait a minute, like what? Like, you know, a little bit like, not really the tooth fairy Santa Claus, but something like really more substantial, that you thought that this was a unshakable truth.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that was anchoring you in the world, and it's got fractures in it.
Yeah. It's almost a seismic shift for her, where the ground that she's always thought was firm starts to kind of, you know, plates are shifting, and it feels as though the ground that she thought was stable and holding her can't. And what do you do when the ground shakes beneath you? What do you cling to? The thing that you always believed? Do you cling to a different truth? What do you do when your entire foundation is rocked? And that's Miriam's question this whole time.
Right. And I feel like, I don't know this, I would love for like a psychologist to be in the chat.
Right.
We're 15 and that happens, and some foundational truth is broken open, or a trust, or a, you know, and if it doesn't get resolved, like emotionally, because there's so much emotion going on about your sense of self in the world, like if it's not, I feel like if you don't get the closure, or you don't get the support, or you don't, it could continue to ripple through the rest of your adult life.
I bet. This idea of what does it mean to form a sense of self in the, you know, apart from all the things that you believed in. And if you don't kind of get that understanding, or if you don't figure those things out, what does that look like as an adult? And what is your sense of, maybe it's a divided self in some ways. What is your sense of self if you never put those pieces together? I don't know. That's a really great question.
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, there's a lot going on in those 15-year-olds. This is something I when the book first came out, and you know, the booksellers are always asking like, oh, what was the pick? What was the pick? What was it about? And so I always had a different spiel than what I think is the normal spiel. And so I wanted a chance for you to be able to say, like, what are we missing if we categorize this book as one about Southern evangelicals?
Yeah, that's such a good question. And it was such a fine line when I decided to write a book about, I didn't set out to write a book about religion. That would feel like, why would anyone do that? And then I end up writing a book about religion. But my agent had this moment when she says to me, this is a book about religion, but it's not a religious book. And so one of my big fears was it was going to be pegged as a book that is, it's for a group of people who believe the same way that the family does, and you know, kind of ascribes to those same ideals. And that's not the book that I set out to write. And so what I say the book is about is, I say it's about a 15-year-old girl who suffers from a crisis of faith after witnessing a particularly horrible act of violence committed by her father over the course of a summer, and how she starts to piece her life together with all these things that could be true, and then these things that she's thought were true that no longer are. So I say it's about disillusionment, it's about patriarchy, it's about faith, but it's about family. And it's about, you know, what do you do when all the things that you thought were true aren't true anymore? And so that part of the book, those things feel really universal. We've all had those moments where this thing that you thought was true isn't, or this belief system that you had falls apart, or someone lets you down, or a parent turns out to maybe not be who you thought the parent was. And that's irrespective of religion. And so I thought that it felt, so when I describe the book, I describe the book that way. There are people who will say, I'm not touching the book, it's about religion, and it's, you know, it's, and sure, but I centered it in this one community, but the truths are pretty universal. It just happens to be a religious girl who feels all these things in the course of a summer. But I hear you on the whole tap dancing when I describe the book, because I don't want to alienate people who would say, oh, I would never touch this book because I don't believe this. But I also think that what's been really wonderful is people have reached out to me who say, I don't believe anything in this book, and I connected to this book, and that matters. And so and reading is an act of empathy in lots of ways. And so what does it mean to kind of take yourself outside of yourself and think about something that may not be your life and your truth, and put yourself in that position for 300 pages? I think it makes us better people when we can do that.
Definitely. Which I'm gonna jump to a question going into that. And I don't know, because I have them all in order for a reason. But this whole idea of empathy and putting yourself in other people's shoes, I thought you did it so beautifully with Ma and Pa. Because even when I read it, listened to it again, because I mean, I walked away, from the book, had some time to sit with. I mean, definitely the Pa character stuck with me.
Yeah.
Very strongly. And Ma too. I mean, oh gosh, I just, there's a lot of sadness in the book. But you wrote those characters, Ma and Pa, with a lot of dimension, a lot of compassion. And when I listened to it again, I was listening more actively for it. But I remembered it enough to, when I dove in again, to be actively looking for it. Like, why do I feel this way? And so, and how you did it, and how you fed the reader information that allowed us to better understand the motivations and reasons why these people have ended up where they're at. And so you're able to put yourself in Pa's shoes. You can put yourself in Ma's shoes. And so you are, as a reader, you're sympathetic, and you resist judgment.
Yeah.
It's not easy to go in and judge, because you've given so much texture. And so did you do that on purpose? Because it's so easy if you just say one thing or another to go and judge.
Yep. So I would say that the hardest character for me to write was Samuel, because I have strong feelings about who he is and how he treats his family and who he becomes, and this way in which his violence precipitates so many of the really bad events in the book. And yet, as a writer, there are two things I had to do. One thing I learned early on, and someone said this, I didn't understand it. I think I was in Iowa, and one of my instructors told me, you're very kind to your characters. And I didn't know what that meant, in the sense of, but I think what she was trying to say, and what I understood, was that I try to create dimension, and I try to kind of, I mean, I'm so connected. They've lived in my brain in this book for 9 years. And so I want them to be realized. I want them to be people, and I want them to not be types. And I want them to be living and breathing and having flesh, even though they're on a page, which came from my head. But so that's one part of it. The second part is that in really early drafts of this book, I came down really hard on the father character. And he was one-dimensional. He was really flat. He was really villainous. And I had an instructor tell me, no one's all bad and no one's all good. And so for the Papa character, Samuel, he was this, awful person. And Miriam was this light and this, delight, and those things aren't real. And so as I revised with, feedback from my editor, from feedback from other instructors, I had to dig in and make him more real. And to make him more real, he couldn't be all bad. So I had to add moments of humanity, and I had to add moments of grappling and searching. And I had to add moments of places where the reader could connect and have compassion for this man who, though I think ultimately he's a character that may be the most, the hardest one to sympathize with in the book, I tried to give you places to kind of ground yourself. And so that was a hard thing for me to switch from seeing him in this one-dimensional way to making him more round. And for Joanne, the Ma character, I felt like for her, I hadn't seen her fully. I saw her as a mother. And I think that in revision, what was really helpful, I did a ton of character journaling, both from the first person perspectives of Samuel and Joanne. And even though this book is Miriam's from the first person, the ideas of who they were, that added itself onto the page. And so the character journaling from Joanne was less about this idea. For Miriam, I always saw her as a mother, but there's so many things about her as a wife and what that marriage has been like and what her struggles have been. And we see her, you said it, I think what I tried to capture is there's a lot of sadness and there is loss and there is pain in this family, a lot of it localized around Joanne. And so what does it mean for her to mother these children and to be a wife to this man who she met when she was a kid and had his kids and then got swept away by him and his religion? And what does that feel like? And how does one mother when one had their own life of abuse that then trickles into the family and the abuse that happens here? So her role and her complicity in it and her feelings of complicity. And then sometimes when she doubles down. So I had to kind of work on her to make her more nuanced, but I spent a lot of time on them and understanding them. And I felt like the journaling helped me figure out who they were and drill pretty deeply into who I wanted them to be and who they ultimately came out to be.
Well, I just think those characters and the way you treated them and created them, I have so much admiration for, because as a reader, it does make you think or go into the practice of like, well, why, instead of just judging, like, why do they do what they do? And that just helps make better humans, right? That just makes us more conscious. And so, a lot of times, we'll talk about the patriarchy. This kind of weaves into it. It's like, sometimes I felt like he was a victim of all the enablement. I'm not giving him any, get out of jail free cards, because he is, there's some monstrous things that he did, but then also to just not just go like, oh, well, he's a monster. It's like, wait, take the extra step. Like your book, the way it's written and the character, how it's written, it invites the reader to take that extra step. Like, why? Like, you give enough to say, for us to do some thinking about how does a person end up like this?
Yeah. And I think, especially with the patriarchy, when I'm thinking about the way obviously the where we see the direct impacts are on Joanne and Miriam, and then where we see the perpetrator of it is the people who enable Samuel. So the churches and the deacons and those structures and the ways that he has aligned himself with this belief system. And then, so we see him kind of enacting these things that are really patriarchal on his family, but he's a victim too. And I think that when we think that patriarchy only hurts women, it does. And I'm not going to say the hurt is the same, but I would say that he is a victim of the ways he's thought. And he's so stuck to this way that he's thought and the way he's believed that he is this kind of, this infallible person, that he cannot see himself differently, and it contributes to his pride. And so when he breaks, there's this moment toward the end of the book where he physically kind of falls apart because everything he's thought that he believed, he's seeing it in his face and it's saying, no, this is not what you believed. And so, no, it's not the same kind of victimization, but he is a victim too of the same system. It affects everyone. Patriarchy is kind of insidious for everybody, not just, Miriam and Joanne are the direct victims and they receive a lot of the physical abuse, but Samuel's also grappling with this system that held him up and enabled him. And what does that mean when that falls away?
Right. It's kind of a reminder, like any crime to another human is a crime to humanity. No one, you don't win. That's just not, it doesn't flow. It just doesn't work. It's just toxic all around.
Right. Exactly.
So going back to Miriam and her mother, what do you think the important outcomes are for Miriam? How will Miriam's outcome differ from her mother? Did you ever write them like the two women in this kind of, her mother also experienced masculine toxicity, gender, struggle. Miriam, I feel like, I don't know. I don't want to say what, did you write them in parallel or is it just kind of, can you would comment on?
Sure. As the book developed, I think that initially they felt really separate to me. And I thought that it would be way more interesting to show what they have in common. And what's striking for Miriam in particular is she starts to see her mother as a woman and her mother as a wife, because her mother has been this, I take care of these things. And Miriam is her own caretaker. Miriam's kind of the glue that holds her family together. And she's seen her mother in this very servile role because that's what, she's allowed to be and do. And as she and her mother start spending time together, so the scene I just read with the Song of Solomon, there's a scene in there. One of my favorite scenes to write was the scene when they were dancing in the kitchen. There are these moments with the two of them together that I think show their deep love for one another. And the deep love then also drives Miriam's profound disappointment, which is, I feel this way. I think this. I want you to be different. I don't want this for you. I don't want this for myself, but I want this for you. But Miriam has no roadmap. This is the life that we have in this family. My mother hasn't shown me a way to get out of this. I have to kind of figure this out for myself. And sometimes her mom's on board, but only to a point. And she's never gonna question this whole thing. I think the section I read talked about she found Samuel and God at the same time, and those two things are really enmeshed. I think that's important. And so Miriam sees herself in her mother, some parts that she really loves, some parts that she's really scared of. And so by the end of the book, there's this notion of kind of what do we do to repair this relationship? And for Miriam, that the final question of the book is, do I want to stay and be like this? Is this the life that I want for myself? And then the reader's left to kind of figure out what that might be. But Miriam struggles with that. Miriam loves her mother and also finds her mother really complicated. And so I hope that the reader sees that there are parallels between them. I put them in tandem. They're foils for each other in some ways. And Miriam is scared. Miriam's scared of, like, I don't want this because this is terrifying. And who my mother has become because of him is really scary.
Right. Yeah. And I thought the way that it ties together at the ending was masterful.
I'm so glad you feel that way, because lots of people don't like it. So I'm so glad.
I don't know why.
So many people don't like it.
Why? It forces you to think.
I think so too. I think people don't often like things that are open-ended. And yeah, but I've gotten between friends of mine who are super close to me, people I love, and people I don't even know, literally saying, you cannot end the book like this. Like, this is not it. And it always was the ending. Once I ended it definitively, this always was the ending. So yes. So I'm so glad you found it masterful, Julie, because
I found it masterful, and I found it would be like, at least it would take over a book club discussion. Like, what did you do? Why did you do it? Because I reread it again just like 2 hours ago.
Yes.
If you kind of led anywhere, and really depending on the reader and the reader's perspective and what the reader brings to, the knowledge of the reader,
right,
they bring to it will help, inform what, what direction. But it's just great discussion. It's great thinking material. So,
and the book itself, and one of the things I was thinking about with this ending is that, and people, if you have, one of the things is, if you have questions or comments, we can absolutely put them in the chat. You can disagree with us about this. One of the things is that the book leaves lots of doors open. So there are questions about, did Samuel ever heal? Did Miriam ever heal? Is any of this real? What are all these things? And I don't tell you. And so the book opens doors and lets in light and space. And so it didn't seem right to me to have an ending that told you what to think. This whole book is about belief, it's about doubt, and it's about faith. And so it felt, it would have felt really disingenuous of me to then shut that door, tie that bow, when the whole book leaves lots of things open and leaves lots of latitude for disagreement. And people can read this exact same book and come out with two different interpretations of the family and what the family did. And that's intentional. So it didn't seem right to find a book that closes a door end the book with a door closing when I kind of opened doors all the way through.
Right, which is exactly why it's a first edition. It was, this is a first edition pick, because the first edition books tend to make the reader think. They're not typically beach reads. They evoke discussion. They raise the consciousness of a lot of issues and a lot of things that are going on in our world that if you don't call it out, you're just swimming in the same water, not asking questions. So which goes, now I'm going to segue into the patriarchy and organized religion, and the parallels. I wanted to get your thoughts on the parallels between them. How are they similar and how are they different?
Between patriarchy and organized religion? That's an hour of us talking, Julie. Yes, if not more. So I think, and what I hope the book exposed is this idea of these things that we believe to be true. And I pick Christianity because that's my background and that's what I'm familiar with. And so I felt like this book could be written about lots of organized religions in general. And so, but this idea of women as subservient, as lesser than, as unable to kind of, as requiring a man for all these types of things. And I almost feel like the ways that we've learned it, the ways that, this is a Baptist family, in the ways that they've internalized it, patriarchy absolutely supports the structure of organized religion as they've understood it. It doesn't exist without patriarchy. And also I feel patriarchy allows people to make easy assumptions about things without actually kind of really digging in deep. It's like, well, this is always the way it's been. Well, but tell me why it's been this way. It's, because the Bible says that. It's like, oh, is that really what it says? And so lots of things are leaned on. And so I think that the patriarchy in organized religion, the one in this Baptist family, one couldn't exist without the other. Like this whole book would collapse if patriarchy didn't exist. And Miriam is this person who's kind of coming up against this system that is so much bigger than her and so much bigger than her family. And she's running into every place she goes. It's, nope, that's not it. No, and no, that's not it. And she has to kind of navigate what that means to re-see her family, re-see her life, re-see all these things with this lens of the patriarchy. And so I think that they are inextricable. I mean, there are probably some religions, organized religions, where they are not. In the main ones that people practice in large numbers around the world, patriarchy is kind of inextricable. And I feel like it allows men to feel a sense of power. And it's destabilizing to think that someone else could have power in this specific, in this specific group. But it's like, well, that's what the Bible was written. That's the way this book was written. And I think it's just an easy way to kind of retain a tight grip on systems of power that may not be serving you. And the book is about how it doesn't serve you. But I think people are still going to find a way to hold on. My book's not going to change anyone, any big opinions about how patriarchy works in religion. But yeah, that's kind of my thought about it.
It helps to open the discussion.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. And I could see why the Ma and Caleb are passive to pause violence, because it's the family structure. They're weaker, physically weaker. But why the deacons? Are they just holding it up just to hold up the system?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right.
They don't know.
Oh, go ahead. No, go ahead.
No, I was gonna say, do they not know any better? Like, how? I was confused. I was like asking myself when you saw like the complicity and the.
Yeah. I think that the one deacon who has the courage to break ranks is Deacon Johnson, who's Micah's father. And he only breaks ranks when it's his daughter that's impacted. It's not like other people are seeing these things happen. And I think it's the church is one container for the way I see this. It's also way broader in the world. So I feel like if you even think about our government, right? You watch people make decisions, but sometimes the bigger frustration is who's around the people making decisions that's just letting that stuff happen. And so the frustration is you have a figurehead and then you have other people that allow the figurehead to do things that become increasingly against their interests or against the interests of the country or the populace. And I think that people are invested in keeping their own ideology intact. And so what it means then for the deacons to go against him, it's not going against a man. It's wait. This figurehead who's coming in the summers and sweeping people, into tents and healing people and curing diseases and doing these things. What does that mean if I put my faith in this person, which then also invites the question of this idea of the person, or is it God, or all these things. Like for them, he's a stand-in. So if all these things I put my faith and my time and my investment, all this stuff in, I feel as though there is a huge risk if I even say that there's something wrong here. And so I think the deacons are this kind of wall of yes men who I think they know better, but they will never break ranks, because what happens when you break ranks? What happened when Deacon Johnson broke ranks with Samuel? And breaking ranks is bigger than Samuel. Breaking ranks is, what does this do with my belief system? What happens when my belief system is kind of tattered? And what does that do? Yeah.
Right. In your own sense of identity.
Right.
Who are you then?
Who am I then? If this is not a thing, if this thing that I believe in is not a thing, what is anything? Right.
Right. Yeah. It can be very unnerving.
Right.
Can knock them off. I want to switch over to disabilities. Yeah. And suffering and healing.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering what, if any, what was the thought behind choosing or having Hannah's disability be cerebral palsy?
Yeah. So there are a few reasons behind that. Number one, the book had to have it in the beginning of it, someone who for Samuel felt like a check on his power. And so if this is a man who goes and heals, there had to be a check on his power in some specific way. And that the immediate check on his power, if we think that that healing is a thing and that's real, then the check on Samuel's power obviously is Hannah. The cerebral palsy is interesting because what it is it's something that's, caused by a lack of, oxygen at birth. And so when you then get back into the scenes of Ma having babies at home, I feel like Samuel feels some complicity a bit in what happened to Hannah. We don't know if that could have been different had Hannah been born in a hospital, had Hannah kind of had different types of, treatment, like if Ma had different types of like prenatal treatment. We don't know those things. But for the purposes of this book, I think I leave open the question of what could that have been prevented had situations been different in the home, had Samuel been less kind of demanding about how births happen, how everything's so closed off and cloistered and claustrophobic. And so it's both of those things. It calls into question the idea of healing and what it means. And it calls into question this idea of Samuel always sees Hannah as could I have done something about this? And that I think drives his way that he distances himself from her and the way that he treats her, the way that he feels very hands-off from her for the whole book, for large parts of the book. There's also this interesting question in the circles of this family about faith and healing. And it would seem obvious, I'm not going to give away the ending, but it would seem obvious that, of course, this is a thing that Hannah would want to be healed from. And I think that I try to call into question, what does it mean to be healed? What does it mean to suffer? What does it mean to be whole? And so I think that we have this ableist view of wholeness and healing. And I try to interrogate that with Hannah, which is Miriam misunderstands what her role is in regard to Hannah and what Hannah needs. And when Miriam becomes like her father, it's when she stops seeing Hannah as a full, whole, healed human. And that's where she falls away. So I also try to question this idea of what does it mean to heal and be whole? And and so like all those things were wrapped into this idea of Hannah being differently abled as well as having cerebral palsy.
Yeah. I like how you bring in the question of, or surface the whole lens of ableism.
Mm-hmm.
Because I don't think we talk about it enough.
Yeah.
And, for a large part, Hannah's perfectly fine.
Hannah's perfectly fine.
Oh,
yeah. Yeah.
Of all the characters, she's the happiest.
Yep. She's perfectly fine. Yeah.
Hey,
and I wanted to make her a character and not a tool or a prop. And so I wanted to just kind of not have Hannah as this, we just bring Hannah along all the time, but have Hannah as this character who has full presence on the pages as part of this family. And that was a thing I was very intentional about, is not to kind of make Hannah this, okay, there's this family, then there's Hannah. It's like, no, Hannah's an integral part of this family. She and Miriam have this bond that I tried to work hard to make really deep and resonant. And so, yeah. And what does it mean? How does that call into question a lot of our ableism?
Right. Yeah. Hannah definitely is I only remember, I really remember the tenderness between Miriam's kind of like her mom.
Mm-hmm.
It's a, you know, she loves and cares for her like a mother, and
yeah,
definitely comes through.
Yeah. And in some ways, I think in the beginning of the book, a lot of the scenes I wrote were about the one of the earliest scenes that we see of Miriam and Hannah is Miriam bathing Hannah when they get to Georgia. And so much of that for Miriam is this book is about healing. It's about lots of things, but the healings for Miriam in the beginning, Miriam's been doing that all along. Miriam is the caretaker. She's the healer. She's the embodiment of kind of love in this, family for Hannah. And so to kind of, when we get to the end, which was hard to write and harder to read, I'm sure, this idea of what does it mean that she's kind of shifted this idea of the way that she loved and cared for Hannah deeply. So, yeah.
Yeah. There's definitely like this, I think, well, as a reader, you feel Miriam's inner conflict and the tension. It's really this, like you said, the story is about her transformation.
Yeah.
Deep examination, which is at the heart of the story. But there's this point where she's pushed, there's two forces that are pushed against each other. It's this, it's like how she's been raised, that,
Yeah.
it's like what's true, like how she's been raised, the truth she's been told, or what she's uncovered and discovered with her own eyes. And those are not interchange. They're mutually exclusive.
Yep.
And and I guess you've been commenting on this dichotomy, this like to what do you do? And
right.
The readers ask, like, what do you do?
What do you do? What do you do when this whole thing happens to you? What does Miriam do when this happens to her? And this book is this book is in pursuit of that question.
Right.
Miriam sees something and she's seen something the previous year, which makes the new thing something she can't shake off. And what do I do when I see something that I can't shake and I can't square it with anything that I know?
Right. And there's this beautiful quote that for me, it captured it. I read it, but then when I listened, it snapped me, it hit me again. But you wrote, it felt like God, who had always been near, the breeze behind me, the heat on my face when I prayed, was receding like the sun behind a cloud. As I was getting closer to my miracle, God's will for me was getting more obscure.
Mm-hmm.
It just really kind of captures how you feel when that, and I love how like the sun because it's cold. I got this, it's cold. It's cold.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's so lonely for Miriam too. This is a lonely journey for Miriam because she's by herself. She has her family with her, but they are with her in body and not in ideas and ideology. She's doing this on her own in this family that's growing increasingly violent. So it's really scary for her.
Yeah. Okay. So we have, we're getting close, but I wanted to make two comments.
Yeah.
I mean, not comments, two questions really quick.
Yeah.
I always think like I'm not going to have enough to talk about. And then I'm always like rushing at the end. I'm like, wait, I really want to hear what you think about this.
Yeah.
So this contradiction about in the institution. So I was getting frustrated because it's like the institution has systems in it that keep its members small. So the smaller you are, the more pious. But then if you question the things that are in the system that are keeping you small, then you're a sinner.
Yeah.
So like I am confused. Like, can you talk a little bit?
Yeah, I don't have any answers. I think that it is. I think there's a way in which, and then if we kind of add a layer of kind of gender onto that as well, is who is expected to stay small, who is expected to stay silent, who is expected to be invisible, and who is expected to kind of toil and labor, but do that really in secrecy and kind of in the shadows. And the book is so much about invisible labor. There's scenes of the deacons having dinner at the Hortons' house. and we see Miriam and Hannah and her mother in the kitchen, and they're serving and they're going back and they're kind of doing these things. And it's this idea of subservience and obedience. And you learn as a girl that, you know, your role is to be of service. It's to God, but in this family, it's to the men. And so so you stay pious and you stay holy if you don't question, because questioning is where Miriam feels like it's sinful, which is, I don't think it is, but for Miriam, she does. And then she learns that, but if I don't question, I stay like this, and I can't stay like this. I've seen too much to stay silent, to just do this thing I've been expected to do. She talks about, she has this moment, the scene right before they go away for the second revival season, where they're just finishing up Easter dinner, and she thinks like, she looks at her hands and she thinks like, this can't just be all I'm supposed to do is clean up after dinner, make food, take care of men. But so how does one grapple with these things, with what I understand and what I'm being told, and Miriam feeling like, no, this can't be all, this can't be it. And seeing her mom as one manifestation of that, and being really scared that this can't be who I become. This can't be.
Yeah, she wants to reject it.
Yep. But there's no blueprint for that. How do you do that?
Right. You don't see it. It's not represented anywhere.
Right.
Okay, I have to say this because this also struck me when I read it the first time, was although your characters are Black and the story takes place in the Black evangelical church, you don't set it up as a racial binary. It's patriarchy, it's gender power struggle, it's male toxicity. These are themes that transcend or the race. These are big issues that move across, racial categorizations. Can you talk to that?
Sure. I think that there is a ton of pressure, and this is, as a debut novelist, this is a kind of a thing that you grapple with a lot. There's so much pressure to kind of write books about Black trauma and Black suffering. And this is not a knock on people who do that at all. But for me, I wanted to write a book about Black people living lives and Black people having the same struggles that other people have. These characters happen to be Black. This book isn't, if you're not Black, you can read and understand this book. And it's, so in the same way that at the beginning I talked about, it's not a religious book, it's a book about religion. The characters are Black, it's not a book about race. It's a book about larger things. But the lens I used was the very specific lens of the Black Baptist Church, which is, again, a place that I'm familiar with. Not this one, like this is a different, I was not raised with this brand in this brand of church. But I think that I wanted to push back against this idea that Black writers must then write stories about Black trauma. I wanted to write a story about trauma. The characters happen to be Black, but it's not racialized trauma. And so it mattered to me to write a book that was dealing with different issues than what would be expected necessarily about, oh, it's a Black writer, then she must be writing about slavery, or she must be writing about police brutality. You can watch Black trauma on the news every single day of the week. And that's not the book I wanted to write. I wanted to write a book that dealt with big questions, but my lens into this world, for me and for kind of what matters to me, she had to be Black, but I feel like the books should be accessible, that the themes are universal, even though the characters themselves may not look like you.
Right. And I love that it's important to have multiple voices that speak on this topic, because the topic, the problem, the issue is huge. And I think having multiple voices helps expose how vast and prevalent the problem is. And the more voices we have on it, I think it just puts in fuller dimension of how important it is for us to address this big problem.
And I have had people reach out to me saying, oh my gosh, did you come to my church? And this idea of like, for people who have never felt seen before, to feel seen from this book from all races felt really validating for this. What I was trying to do with this project is I wanted to speak to people in their situations in their lives, regardless of what you look like, but the lens in the world is Black. But I think that there's a lot to grab onto, and people have said, oh my gosh, I never knew a book like this could exist. And that's been really, really meaningful.
Yes. For sure. Yeah. Like the one reviewer said, like it's something you didn't even realize that this was missing in the canon.
Yeah.
So, it's great. We have one question. We have time. Well, we don't really. Well, if you have a burning question, put it in. Sorry, I've hogged up everyone's time to write.
Your questions are great, Julie.
But Anne Caggiano asks, "Do you have another book in the works?"
The
No
answer
rest for the
is
weary, Monica.
no rest for the weary at all. The answer is yes. What's interesting is that I finished Revival, and I was and right before I was kind of getting toward the end of Revival in 2017, like an early draft of it. And I said, oh my gosh, I don't know what's next, because books appear to me in images, and then I write my way through the image to make sense of a story. And so I hadn't seen an image yet, and I didn't know what. I said, wait, this one's done. It's about to be done. What's happening? What's the next thing? And then soon after that, when this one was kind of ending and I was kind of wrapping it up, I saw the image that led to what is the book I'm writing right now, which is, and I pushed against it because I didn't necessarily want to kind of delve into similar ground. It's not the same ground, but where it is, what it's leading me to is this story of this man who becomes this cult leader. So I'm staying with ideas of patriarchy and power. Those are fascinating to me. And I could talk about that all the time. But watching his rise through the perspective of three of his wives, watching his rise and fall. And so he has these three wives, three of several wives. But I think a lot about the idea of kind of why they gravitate toward him, why they stay, what he feels like to them, what he means to them, watching their whole identity be, centered around this man who's pretty monstrous. Like, and Samuel is, part of something that at least feels organized. This man is kind of on his own doing stuff that's pretty awful. And so there are three third-person narrators telling the story of this man who leads this congregation called The Way. And it becomes this splinter thing that becomes pretty violent and pretty awful. But I want to stay with the women. And so I'm telling the story from three of his wives. So that's the book I'm working on now. And I'm trying to see the story all the way through. Yeah.
Wow. Well, we can't wait. That will be an in-person event.
Yes. Fingers crossed for that.
Yes. Okay. So Nick has popped up on the screen, and I think it's time.
It does sound like the time, yes. It sounds like we're wrapping up. I want to thank one last time Julie and Monica for coming through tonight. It was a very exciting and good conversation. Made me very happy. I was happy to hear the story and this conversation. We don't get very many conversations like these nowadays, what with all of these large stores closed down and whatnot, but I'm glad that conversations with authors and Book Passage, hosts like Julie, authors like Monica can come through and have them here. We have found a way. But thank you to all of you for coming out tonight, to everybody that's made it out in the audience. We can't do stuff like this without your support. So if you did enjoy the video, you can click the thumbs up button just below it. It lets us know that you enjoyed yourself. And again, if you want to see more conversations like these, you can subscribe. And especially the biggest thing is, if you'd like to purchase the book, please go to the link in the description box just below the video or pinned to the top of the chat and purchase it from Book Passage. We'll ship it to your house just like every other online retailer in the world will. Pretty straightforward for that. Anyways, one last time, thank you everybody for coming out. I do truthfully hope to see you all in the next one. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.